My name is Nasser. In this video, you'll learn how to write a method section for your scientific manuscript. So before we begin, remember to subscribe, share, and like. So let's start by talking about what is in a method section. So it comes after the introduction in your paper. I highly recommend checking out my blog and my video on writing an introduction, telling your story. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. It's the simplest section to write, the method section. So you don't want to include any arguments, results, data, discussion in this. You want to describe how you solved a particular problem or answered your research question which you posed in your introduction. So what is in a method section? Essentially, you want to give enough information so that someone reading your article can go away and can conduct a falsification test. So you want to include information like make and model of equipment, the consumables you use, the sample size, chemicals, etc. You can kind of think of it as a cake recipe. So when you read a recipe for baking a cake, you include all the ingredients, so the egg, sugar, flour, milk, and you also give information about how much of those ingredients you use. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to bake a cake successfully. So how do you go about writing a method section? So your work needs to be reproducible. So as I've already mentioned, someone somewhere will be reading your work and they should have enough information so they could go away and reproduce what you have done with the same methodology. So you've got to ask yourself, have I included enough information for someone like me to replicate this methodology? And if the answer is no, then clearly there's more information that you need to include. I also recommend writing your method section as you do your experiments. That way you can remember certain details. Organize it into logical subheadings as well. That just makes it easier to follow your methodology. And I'd also use standard naming conventions. So for units of measurements, for chemicals, various animal species, whatever you use in your research, it has to be widely known and understood by the wider community. So you might want to refer to everything in kilograms or in moles, or use chemical symbols from the periodic table that everyone is familiar with. So things that you need to cover in your method section. So there are three things essentially. That's the site characterization, experimental method, and statistical analysis tools. So with the site characterization, you need to give information about the chemicals or organisms that you used in your research or your study, and the site where experiments actually took place. In the experimental design, you want to give a step-by-step instruction of what you did. Information about sample preparation, all the equipments that you used, so make and model, the experimental conditions, experimental controls, and all the measurements, quantities, amounts of chemicals and other items that you've used throughout your methodology. You may want to also include the statistical analysis tool. So how did you analyze your data? So did you use a linear regression? Did you do analysis of variance? Or what kind of software package did you use to analyze your data? Give information about that in your methods section. Now going back to the example of a cake recipe, of course, you'll need a few items of equipment. You might need, for example, an oven to bake your cake. Now, it is assumed that everyone has an oven in their kitchen, and you won't need a specific type of oven. It just needs to be a generic oven, and you should be able to go about baking the cake. Similarly, depending on your area of research, you may have common tools or equipment that you use that doesn't necessarily need to be mentioned in great detail. So in my area of research, I use a scanning electron microscope. Now it is a good idea to include the make and model. So for example, a Joule 2000 scanning electron microscope, but essentially anyone with access to a scanning electron microscope should be able to obtain similar images, similar data as you did. If you want to see a good example of how to write a method section, head on over to my blog, method section, what you did. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. So I take an excerpt from my original research article, which is open access. You can access it and view it from anywhere. And I describe how I prepared my samples for my experiments. So I'll go into more detail on that, so it's well worth the read. So, what do you think? Remember to check out my methods section, What You Did blog on my website. Again, the link to that in the description. Do you think I missed something? Do you need help with proofreading and editing of your work? I'd love to hear from you. Remember to subscribe, share and like.